Okay, so I think we'll get going now. Just like to thank you all for coming out this evening. We've got a great program lined up for the weekend, and we'll be talking a bit about that more tomorrow. For this evening, we're excited to have two plenaries by two great speakers who have made very important contributions to hypnosis. Our first one today is David Godot, doctor, who is based in the Center for Discovery in Whittier, California.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. So, I want to tell you a story about. Can you hear me, Steve? Do I have to eat this microphone? Can you hear me now? I want to tell you a story about the future of clinical training and evidence-based practice. But I want to start out right at the beginning. You see, in around 2008, this guy, Edward Frischholz, asked me if I wanted to help him teach the SCEH Introductory Hypnosis Workshop at Reno that year. And he said that the evidence, the interventions that we're using are evidence-based. So shouldn't the training be empirically validated as well? Seemed like a good idea to me, so we consulted with all the top experts. And started collecting data. Cheers, buddy. Actually, let's start out a little bit earlier than that. You see, nearly every culture in the history of humankind has guarded its knowledge. You go back to the beginning of written language, and in early societies, language was sacred. It was held back from the common people and was reserved for the scribes and royals and priesthood. And the practice of medicine, I mean, we're talking about nothing less than conjuring life and vitality in the sick and dying. This is magic, and it was regarded as magic. In early Western cultures, healing tended to be regarded as something that was not for the profane. The practices of healers were kept very secret and were closely guarded. Here's some examples from early societies. This is a Sumerian scroll, and you can see the medical team, the healers, providing sacred herbs and also performing a ritual over the afflicted. Same deal exactly in ancient Egypt. Something very interesting going on at the sleep temples of Asclepios in ancient Greece. You can see they would give them a concoction and do a lot of touching and passing over their bodies, inducing a state of deep stupor and slumber, which people would travel from far away in order to get the widely recommended results of. In fact, this guy, Hippocratic, the father of modern medicine, trained at the Asclepian healing temples, and he introduced the practice of what we now know as clinical medicine in the 3rd century BC, which is basically observation and intervention. He said that illness is not caused by spiritual infirmity, but is caused by physiological processes. And so, in other words, it's not the ritual that we're conducting; it's the herbs. The ritual is just superfluous; it's extra. But the thing about Hippocrates is that he actually knew very little about the body because it was taboo to study it in ancient Greece. So Hippocratic medicine focused on prognosis. How long can we expect this person to last? Rather than diagnosis. So what's wrong with them? What can we do for it? Intervention involved mostly just rest and palliative care that would provide kind of common sense treatments. Later physicians called this type of Hippocratic method a meditation on death. And gradually, over the centuries, the idea of taking care of the sick and dying kind of came into fashion. During the early plagues of the 3rd century, you can see here a painting of some of the sick who had been thrown out to the edge of town. It was very common people would come down with these illnesses to just throw them out in the street or take them out and dump them outside the city. Early Christians actually started the practice of collecting up these discarded sick people and setting up hospitals, what they called hospitals for them, which were essentially just places where they would lay until they either died or something miraculous happened. ancient magical healing techniques were forbidden because Christianity had taken hold in Europe. But the study of human anatomy remained illegal in most of Europe until the 17th century. So it's a very long time of just not knowing anything about the way that the body is really working, other than what had been passed down from ancient Egypt when they were studying the circulatory system and things of this nature. In medieval times, there were some advances in clinical practice. Gradually, observations and ideas started to form into techniques. Many of these ideas were not what we would consider to be very good ideas. Things like bleeding, and leeches, and trepanning, and cauterization. Cauterization, pretty good idea sometimes. But no medical colleges existed for a very long time, really until just the last couple of centuries from today. And like I said before, some of those healing, folk herb practices had trickled into this new advancing clinical practice, but very little actual medicine was being done at that time. And really things remained that way. Medical theory and practice were split for about 2,000 years into these two basic camps, what I'm calling the mystic process model, and on the other side, the Hippocratic secular clinical model. And really only since the introduction of Cartesian dualism in the 17th century, has common culture and its various power structures really come to accept this idea of advancing secular clinical practice outside of spirituality. And in that time, the prevailing power structures have become kind of equally uncomfortable with practices associated with these mystical process models of healing art. So then in the 18th century, something very interesting started happening, with modern hypnotism essentially emerging from some middle ground in between those two models, this mystic process and the secular clinical healing models, which at this time were starting to emerge as really the best practice. Medical schools were beginning to set up. People were trained really under just apprenticeship model. You kind of watched what someone was doing, and they watched you do it, and then you went and did it yourself. There wasn't a lot of research just yet. But I hope, the reason I'm kind of going through all this history is because I'm really hoping to give you kind of a new perspective on this historical development. And I know that I'm in the room with some of the people in the world who are the most familiar with this historical progress. But I hope that I can kind of twist it just a little bit. And I want to start in an unlikely place, the Catholic Church, with this guy, Father Johannes Joseph Gassner, who was an 18th century Bavarian priest. And he was getting really impressive results treating illness as though it were demonic possession. And he used a variation on the centuries-old Catholic exorcism rites, inducing this kind of abreaction, what we would call now. And then subsequently, he did something that other priests weren't doing at that time. He introduced a kind of a cognitive intervention where he gave them advice about how they would live their life in a more spiritually sound state. And he was getting good results. I want to go back to note, though, that in learning exorcism, it wasn't something that just anyone could do, and this was not really done by an apprenticeship model like medicine was. Basically, the way it works within the Catholic Church is that priests of a particular temperament will kind of be elected and sent to the Vatican to experience these secret training rituals. And they use rites which are intentionally obfuscated through the use of Latin, as they have been for centuries. And these Catholic rites, as secretive as they are, they still actually are relatively out in the open in terms of mystical practices. The Catholic Church hasn't had much need to hide itself throughout the years, other than to obscure its inner teachings from the commoners. But the actual processes themselves have always been held in secret. This guy, Franz Anton Mesmer, who most of you have probably heard of, he had been under the guidance of Father Maximilian Hell, a Jesuit priest who had learned from Paracelsus the use of magnets for healing. And they would pass these magnets over people, and after seeing Gassner accomplish the same things without the use of any magnets, that's when Mesmer had this bright idea that, wait a minute, I thought I was using magnets to heal people, but maybe there was something else. And he decided that it was an innate fluid or an energy that was responsible. But I want to suggest that there's a little bit more to that Of course, most of you are probably familiar with the way that Mesmer's ceremonies went down. The session was performed according to a very theatrical ritual. Inside a large magnetic salon decorated with large mirrors supposed to reflect invisible fluids. And under the resonance of drums, coupled with the eerie sound of the legendary blast harmonica played by an imposing Mesmer, wrapped in an esoteric cloak, and his silent assistants based in every corner of the room to control the convulsing patients, looked quite as impressive as their master. It's a very mystical and esoteric scene. And as it turns out, Mesmer had a long esoteric background. From youth, his favorite pastime was the study of obscure, esoteric, mystical works. And by the time he rose to prominence as a physician, he was actually a member of several magical societies, including he was both a Freemason of the Scottish Rite, and he was also a member of a more overtly magical society called the Order of the Golden Rose Cross, which is a Rosicrucian society. Now, let me tell you a little about the way that magical societies are structured. Magical secret societies, such as the Order of the Golden Rose Cross and the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, encode their teachings symbolically, so that candidates are gradually awarded the keys to understanding these symbols in a series of grades, so that over time, as they ascend through the ranks, the symbols and rituals that they've been exposed to the whole time begin to take on new meanings. So in this way, the secret teachings are hidden in plain sight, but you have to become the right sort of person to understand. So this is a very powerful way to hide inner teachings. And gradually, the person, they become the type of person who can understand, not just a person who possesses a particular piece of knowledge, but you have to internalize a certain type of vision in order to interpret symbols in a new way. So, in short, what you experience when you're being initiated at the various levels of a magical secret society is an associative and experiential learning process, rather than a method of didactic instruction. Mesmer, actually, once he discovered the methods of animal magnetism, stopped reporting his experiments and his methods. He actually refused to participate in the Royal Commission's study of his methods. He allowed one of his students to participate, but he became quite secretive as soon as his methods started being very effective. And he actually started his own magical secret society, which taught his principles of healing through ritualistic demonstration. That was called the Society of Universal Harmony. But Mesmer's techniques that he was teaching through this experiential associative method were not actually unique. Around the same time, Abbe Faria and James Esdale were learning some of these same techniques of hypnotism or mesmerism from Indian mystics, from Hindu fakirs and yogis who had been passing these teachings down through generations. The mystical way, through associative and experiential instruction. You have to become the type of person who gains this knowledge. So something different is definitely happening. The knowledge is the same. But by way of Mesmer, Bray, Faria, and Esdale, these mystic healing practices were getting rolled into this new emerging secular paradigm of clinical practice. So instead of causing candidates to have experiences which transform them into healers, they began simply learning these techniques of healing. Very new, never been done before. This is not a huge problem in the hypnosis community, incidentally, because we do tend to self-select. You can look through history, sensitive practitioners like Puisséguer and Deleuze were beginning to study and experiment and expanding their own practices. And the primary method of training at that time was reading what those guys were writing about what they were doing. And if the luxury was available to you, sometimes you would travel across Europe and wherever you were, or maybe one of them would happen to be in your town, and you could watch them work. And that was the best method of training available. But most people were just reading and practicing things on their own. And certainly some practitioners got better results than others. Unlike the 1785 Royal Commission's view, the popular view at that time was that in addition to the patient's imagination, the force of the practitioner's imagination was also very important. this unanswered question, I find, might be important to us today. In light of this idea that the patient's imagination is a powerful and important curative factor, what is imagination? And how does it ever influence anything? I think that's a question we ultimately don't really have the answer to, although I have some ideas about it that I'll present later. So let's briefly review some of the other developments in clinical practice and other areas of clinical practice. The 19th century saw really this explosion of what we now call modern medicine. Scientific methods were improving, studies were being organized, and the hospital really became the center of both clinical research and training, and it was all still under an apprenticeship model. You watch somebody do something, and then you did it yourself. And this is still really the way that surgical techniques are taught, although medical practitioners now have obviously a lot more didactic education. And we're beginning to kind of march in this time period towards a scientific paradigm of medicine. Psychiatry emerged around this time, which was starting to displace ideas about mental problems being related to spiritual infirmity. And then even psychotherapy started to emerge with its new types of clinical supervision, its new ideas about how to treat people. But all of this, in terms of training, was still based on observational apprenticeship learning. And as training moved out of the hospital and into academia, it became much more academic. Clinical research took on a greater importance, much more didactic methods, but the methods of treatment were also changing because old methods were disproven in the experiments, and new methods were not disproven, and so then we put them into use. And an emphasis gradually evolved on using interventions which had been demonstrated to work in an evolving scientific process. Let's look at recent evolutions in clinical training. So really, hypnosis is at the forefront of this. Most hypnosis practitioners continued learning through this kind of method of reading, observation, self-initiated practice well into the 20th century. But about mid-20th century, in 1947, there was a growing sentiment toward professionalization, which culminated in Jerome Schneck founding this society, the Society of Clinical and Experimental Hypnosis. A few university programs were starting, and 3-day workshops began to become popular methods of learning under a variety of practitioners. And this format actually is still today the most popular way for a new practitioner to learn hypnosis. And hypnosis is, as a matter of fact, the first clinical specialty to ever develop a unified standard of training. Elkins and Hammond in 1998 published their research, the first and only research, establishing a consensus among professionals at that time as to the minimum standards of training, what topic areas needed to be covered in order for somebody to be well familiarized with the history and nature and practice of hypnosis. Ideally, we base our standard on what actually works, but professional consensus is a good starting point. So this was a major move towards scientific education. And the suggested curriculum that they created based on that research was accepted by both the American Society of Clinical Hypnosis and this society. However, note that the completion of this suggested training does not imply competence in the use of hypnosis, and it never has. So standards of training in other areas of clinical specialty, there really isn't much to look at. The American Psychological Association in 2004, 15 years later, approved a standard of training for doctoral level psychology programs, but the sole criterion for that standard of training is the degree to which a program has achieved its stated training model, not the degree to which it has produced any particular outcome. The American Academy of Clinical Neuropsychology tried to develop some training standards around the same time, but the effort really fell apart amid infighting and disagreements, and so no standard was ever established. Standards of training for other specialized clinical techniques may be a better point of comparison, because it has been argued that hypnosis may be more properly viewed as a technique that's useful to a variety of specialists rather than a clinical specialty in and of itself. But again, very few good examples exist. Medical specialties and surgical techniques that require additional training post-doctorate are taught through an apprenticeship model, the same as always. In psychology, cognitive behavioral therapy is the most widely study a set of interventions, but no agreed upon standard of training for it exists. In fact, no one has even called for a standard of training for cognitive behavioral therapy until 2006, and there's been no progress in that regard as far as I can see. So empirically validated treatment, I started to talk about this growing scientific paradigm in clinical practice, and this has evolved into what we now know as empirically validated treatment. And it's becoming more and more the standard in both medicine and in clinical psychology. And it does have the potential, if implemented well, to ensure consistent quality of services, continuity of care between providers, but how do you ensure competence in its administration? How about empirically validated training? This is a brand new concept that originated with this guy at Frischholz. Some authors have suggested that the establishment of clinical competence is as important as the validation of the treatment itself. But I'm not aware of any published studies which have subjected any type of clinical training program to scientific scrutiny. It just has not taken place. So the question on the table is, are clinical practitioners competent to administer the evidence-based treatments that they have been trained to administer? And the answer is, nobody knows. Nobody can know. We have no way to know. So Ed and I set out to measure how well our workshops were imparting skill. We decided to focus in on the skill of conducting a hypnotic induction procedure. So we used an expert rating model to test the effectiveness of the 3-part hypnotic induction training modules that we're using in our basic hypnosis workshops. And according to our expert raters, as you can see, this is a 0 to 3 scale, and nobody scored a 0, with 1 being the minimal level of competence to enter into clinical practice. All of our participants are now competent in the induction of hypnosis. Woohoo! We did good. But as it happens, I'm a clinician, and I'm really mostly interested in clinical results. And so I would like to see some clinical results, please, but I can't see them. Because as obvious as this idea sounds to me, in fact, nobody has ever devised a way of measuring the effectiveness of a clinical training program based on the clinical outcomes that its trainees will go on to achieve in practice. In fact, we don't even know what variables we would study. We don't know how to design the studies. We don't know what makes one clinician more effective than another. But rest assured, some clinicians are far more effective than others across the board. Let's review a few studies in the field of psychotherapy. Major study of psychotherapist effects. The best therapists produce change 10 times faster than the average. The worst therapists actually showed an average increase in symptoms over the course of the study. Same thing with psychiatrists. The study of psychiatrists looked at how well do individual practitioners do administering a placebo or administering an actual antidepressant. Well, it turned out that good psychiatrists are more effective administering the placebo than bad psychiatrists are with a real drug. And this is not limited to mental health. Don't fool yourselves into thinking that this is all problems of the mind, because in fact, empathic primary care doctors have been shown to give their patients shorter and less severe colds. Not only that, but they also get better A1C and LDL measurements from diabetic patients. Isn't that useful? I wonder how they do that. I have no idea. How do they do that? Surgeon effects account for around half of complications and reoperations in lumbar operations. So this is clearly something that is affecting every area of clinical practice, and we are not studying it. Even as the evidence-based treatments movement has become more widely adopted and clinical training programs have grown longer and more intensive, expanding to 4 times the length that they once were, medical care has, in the meantime, become the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States. Are clinical training and treatment mandates undermining some unknown practitioner variable? It sure looks that way, doesn't it? So, what are we doing about this? Well, there actually are some moves in research to study factors that might affect the relationship between the provider and the recipient of the treatment. So relationship factors actually at this point are becoming more broadly recognized. In fact, the U.S. government's National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs and Practices provides a detailed accounting of the evidence-based therapy relationship. And These are factors like empathy and alliance and collaboration and congruence. But nobody is asking the question of how do these factors develop? Doesn't it just sound like we're talking about likability and charisma? We may as well be talking about personal power, right? Well, how do you become a powerful person? Let's bring this full circle. How does a modern clinician become the type of person who creates powerful healing relationships? How does one become a powerful person? That's the question that's of importance to me as a clinician, because I would sure like to be one of the ones whose patients get better 10 times faster than the average, and not one of the ones whose patients get worse over time. How does a person become a healer? Well, traditionally, this has always occurred, as I've demonstrated, as an effect of direct transpersonal experiences. From a scientific perspective now, what do those experiences actually do to a person? If you were to go through some complicated initiatory process, what would happen to you? Well, remember the Royal Commission. They said that imagination was the key to healing. And for 250 years, most of us have generally kind of bought into that idea that the major curative factor lies in the patient's imagination. But what if, and actually this idea is generally supported by placebo trials, and, although we now know that no placebos work as well, so that kind of, that calls into question some of the ingredients. But nevertheless, we know that the patient's imagination is important, and patient factors account for a large proportion of treatment outcomes. But I think we should reconsider the practitioner's imagination as well, because imaginative involvement does seem to produce belief and expectancy. And those two ingredients probably increase persuasiveness. They alter communication style, which affects patient experiences. But I wonder if more subtle factors might not also be in play. Let's look at imagination in terms of what it actually is. What do we know scientifically about imagination? Well, it influences study outcomes to the extent that most published research findings are false. A fellow who has been writing extensively about this and doing meta-analysis across many different fields of science and medicine, John Ioannidis, has declared in a paper by the same title, this is a quote from the title of the paper, most published research findings are false. And in psychotherapy research, this phenomenon is very well known. We call it researcher allegiance. And it is so pernicious that a recent meta-analysis, and a meta-analysis of meta-analyses, which were designed to cull multiple studies in order to control for bias, this meta-analysis found that even the meta-analyses had succumbed to researcher allegiance. So imagination certainly influences study outcomes. Imagination also, it turns out, influences the nature of matter. In a recent series of 6 double-slit experiments, factors associated with consciousness affected quantum wave function interference patterns in predicted ways. And these particular types of consciousness-associated factors included meditation experience, included electrocortical markers of focused attention, included psychological factors such as openness and absorption. That should sound familiar to us in the hypnosis community. So the results of this study in physics should support a consciousness-related interpretation of the quantum measurement problem. And this is not a foreign conclusion in the world of physics. In fact, here's a quote published in Nature. And in 2005, physicists are being forced to admit that the universe is a mental construction. Nothing exists but observations. The universe is immaterial, mental, and spiritual. This is from the journal Nature, one of the most prestigious journals in the world. Non-local interactions, we know, do not only occur between subatomic particles. For a long time, that was the major critique of this idea that these quantum effects might have larger macro-level influences on our lives. But in fact, a recent study used EEG to monitor 2 separate and completely shielded samples of same DNA human neural tissue. And they found that when they stimulated one sample with a laser, correlated effects occurred in the other sample. What is going on? We've got resonance, quantum non-locality between human neural tissue samples So if a patient's own imagination can influence their neurology, and by extension, if we're influencing neurology, we are influencing their physiological status, could another resident individual have imaginings that might accomplish the same effect? There is, in fact, some evidence of action at a distance in healing practices. This is a Hawaiian healer. In a study of, an fMRI study recently found that distant intentionality that was directed by these Hawaiian spirit healers invoked activations in anterior and middle cingulate and frontal areas of the brains of recipients in experimental conditions. A vast number of cases of volitional action at a distance have been reported throughout history, particularly in individuals demonstrating unusual effectiveness. Some of these powerful people were able to be powerful whether they were even in a room with somebody. And a meta-analysis of 30 studies on intentionality at a distance showed measurable effects on autonomic activity in recipients. There's also, this has kind of been studied on the periphery in the area of bioenergetics and Psy. These are not all new ideas. Howard Hall presented compelling evidence for a distinction between hypnotic phenomena, as we know them, and bioenergetic phenomena. This is actually a screenshot taken from Howard Hall's Discovery Network special, in which he was measuring his energy field as he used a Sufi wound healing technique to puncture his cheek with an ice pick. And this is what his energy field looked like when that was happening. And then he pulled it out and there wasn't the blood because he was in contact with Allah. I'm not really sure on the details, but I do think it's fascinating. Hypnosis, Cardania demonstrated, increases incidence of Psy phenomena. And I wonder, might that also mean that interpersonal resonance could be increased by some type of either general or specific experience? Charles Tart asserted that Psy phenomena occur more frequently in situations that are meaningful to the people involved. I think we're starting to build up a list of ingredients almost. So here are my conclusions. To develop a truly evidence-based training program, we need to be studying not only treatment effects, but practitioner effects. We need to take into account all the evidence. And we need to do so in a manner that is not bound by our current mythology of reductionism that's prominent in our era. Hypnosis, our field, us in this room, we have led the way in the development of clinical practice in every area from the very beginning. In the development of psychotherapies, in the development of clinical training practices. And I suggest that we continue to lead the way by advancing the development of training practices which enhance practitioner effects explicitly and thereby produce evidence-based healers. If my hypotheses here are correct, then what that will entail is an experiential training program which enhances 3 key ingredients that I've identified, and these may or may not be correct, I have no idea. Imagination seems to be a major factor. Interpersonal resonance seems to be a major factor, and elicitation of meaningful events. Those seem to be the 3 things which powerful people have in common. So here are my recommendations for the Society of Clinical and Experimental Hypnosis. The first is we need to develop a new standard of training for clinical and experimental hypnosis. We need to enhance both the scientific grounding and the scientific background of that training and the experiential components which cause people to become the types of people that see symbolically and experientially what factors are involved in the healing process. We also need to increase our involvement with multidisciplinary research communities that hypnosis has been effective for and that have effects on the way that we perceive what we do. Fields such as neuroscience, physics, parapsychology. I feel like at a lot of different points in our history we've tried to eschew some of these friendships with the parapsychologists, and certain individuals like Stan Krippner and Charles Tart have definitely pushed on forward with very excellent, high-quality research in that area. I think we need all the friends we can get, and parapsychologists, because of the nature of their phenomena, have often been subjected to a higher standard than other areas of research. The areas of medicine we are definitely embedded with, but need to become more embedded with. We also need to promote and encourage and support and engage in research on the following areas. The effective practices in hypnosis, of course, which we're already teaching. The process variables in the hypnotic relationships. What processes are in play which make a hypnotic relationship effective? What practitioner effects are involved in hypnotic response? How does someone become a powerful hypnotic practitioner or a powerful healer? And finally, training effects on practitioner effectiveness. What effects in the training workshop have an ultimate impact on how effective our practitioners will be in practice? That's all I have for you. Thank you very much. Okay, it looks like we have a little time for questions. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Okay, I guess let's get a microphone.
Thank you, Dave. That was a great presentation.
Thank you.
I wonder if I could get to one of the some of the recommendations that you had when you were talking about your 3 factors. If you could go back to those slides.
Yeah, you bet. Which ones?
That one right there, yeah.
Okay.
So I find this to be a really interesting idea. I think it's certainly been useful in the history of hypnosis, particularly in recent history, for us to have focused on the important patient variables involved in how hypnotic phenomena occur. But I'm also very much taken with the idea of looking at what we do as well. So I was wondering if you could maybe give us some more of your thoughts about these 3 factors and maybe even some clinical examples from your own work where you've kind of felt these sort of factors at play in your own work.
I mean, you know, it's very difficult to tease these apart from subjective phenomena that I may be experiencing. And honestly, you know, I have not been involved in research on these factors, and I would have to really sit down and think about how to design good experiments to research these factors, and I really haven't done that at this point. You know, the idea of interpersonal resonance is particularly interesting to me because, you know, in hypnosis we talk about this idea of rapport being a key ingredient in the successful elicitation of hypnosis and in the successful treatment using hypnosis, and even in psychotherapy we talk about rapport being an essential ingredient of forming that relationship. But I wonder how many different factors are involved in rapport. Is it really just one phenomenon? And I genuinely don't know. Maybe there is a particular level of rapport at which there is an enhanced physiological resonance. Certainly the evidence shows that you know, that people tend to come into line with each other just by sharing a room. You know, our heart rates come into line with each other, and our breathing patterns come into line with each other. I wonder, do more subtle factors also come into line? Do we tend toward the same types of brain waves? Do we tend towards the same type of epigenetic markers over time? And actually, if I think about my personal experience, and you know, and there's kind of the you know, there's a piece of folk wisdom about married couples gradually coming to look more and more like each other, or even better, people coming over time to look like their dogs, which I've noticed. Maybe there is, in fact, you know, maybe a certain level to which the mere presence of one another creates this sort of epigenetic resonance. And it's kind of a far-out idea, but it does seem to make sense, you know, in terms of some of the, you know, some of the experiences that we have. But it's really tough to say whether that might be a real phenomenon. I'll take questions from David and Steve in just a second. I want to just mention something about elicitation of meaningful events, because this one is one that I was kind of befuddled in even how to word as I was writing it on this slide, because, you know, we talk in psychotherapy about meaning making as being such an important factor in somebody becoming well. And certain people do seem to be more adept at the creation of metaphor and at the creation of meaning, of stringing together disparate ideas into a pattern, you know, pattern recognition even. And it seems to be a skill that can be learned. And I wonder, does becoming a more meaning-making or meaning-recognizing person also create interpersonal power? It'd be a fascinating topic to study. David?
Not a question so much as a comment. The new notion of public
bubbling up in neuroscience where people contribute their own data to a center point. And I remember on the listserv a series of statements where people contributed stories of their own. Hypnotist therapists talked about their own trance. And that was pretty, I thought, pretty interesting. The other thing that was interesting is a lot of people shot it down and said, we don't want to talk about that. Which suggests the idea of a listserv where we who are interested in hypnosis can do public science and contribute our stuff safely to talk about imagination and talk about interpersonal resonance and talk about some of these variables that you want to discuss. The only way to get them is to get a large body of them available. And I think that would be a very interesting way to begin to study what you're talking about.
Yeah, I love what you're saying. You know, and as a matter of fact, I'm thinking about how powerful it would be if this community of clinicians and researchers established some sort of an online platform whereby we could develop experiments that, you know, where we could collect, you know, practice-based evidence, real experiences from the field in some sort of a systematic way, and share them. And that technology is a reality. So, you know, who knows what types of incredible things that we can find, because this, you know, this group has definitely tended to, I think, historically have more marginal experiences than the average practitioners of science and medicine. Steve?
Dave, I was very struck by what you said about expectations in the practitioner and how that interacts with evidence-based medicine. So what can join my study, or what happens in evidence-based medicine, it often produces negative evidence. There is no association. We can't prove that there is a benefit. I wonder if that effect is to make the condition less effective.
You know, I think that's a powerful idea, and I can't speak to any science related to it, but I can speak from my personal experience that I have noted, you know, over prolonged periods of time that the mental set and the expectations and beliefs that I have during a given, let's say, 1 or 2 year period, you know, they tend to shift as my situation shifts and my personality shifts over time. But I have found that I tend to, and this sounds unrespectable to be honest, but I do tend to find myself in the types of situations that are resonant with or are comparable to my internal state. And, you know, that's about all I can possibly say about that. But when I am in a negative mindset, I have noticed over a prolonged period of time of observing that, which I would say probably about 15 years I've been really paying attention to that phenomenon in my own life. And I have certainly noticed that, that the ideas and images and symbols and myths and metaphors which hold sway over me at a given time do seem to influence the reality that I inhabit. And certainly a lot of that is, you know, is confirmation bias. But I have wondered if there's not something else going on. Eric?
Very, very cool presentation, David.
Thank you.
Maybe being from Latin America, I mean, the subject of interpersonal resonance resonates with me. and obviously the research on quantum physics right now and all this stuff. I'm wondering if there could be maybe something that could be considered that is not only me imagining something happening in the other, but also the other imagining something happening in me, and which one is more powerful. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. I don't remember who it was that said it's a wise hypnotist who knows who's hypnotizing who. Was it Weissenhofer? But yes, absolutely. I mean, it would have to work in both directions. I mean, in order to, if these effects that I'm suggesting are indeed a real phenomenon, then one would have to account for the fact that you know, a truly powerful individual would have to be would have to resonate in such a way, or project, or whatever it might be, in such a way as to overcome whatever was being sent from the other side. Yes?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I came in a little bit late, so I only caught the tail end of the lecture, but from a few things that you said, I just wanted to point out, and this might be completely unwarranted, but one of the things that I caught was that you're sort of recommending or suggesting that we should embrace neuroscience and physics and parapsychology and so on. I think that it's really important to be very judicious and careful about who you embrace. This is a precarious situation where if you are reaching out to other controversial modalities, you're likely to increase your controversy by factors that are exponential. The field requires, in my opinion, a certain air of rigor and a certain air of formality and scientific sort of investigation that would endorse it and would further fuel it, as opposed to make it a little bit more prone to criticism that it's flaky or something of that nature. So I think that when we're talking about teaming up with other researchers or practitioners, I think that's also a factor to think about.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. The farther away you go from the normative mindset, of course, the greater rigor will be expected of you. But then on the other hand, there have been a great number of instances in which, some of which I've discussed earlier in this talk, in which the prevailing mindset and the prevailing scientific paradigm was profoundly incorrect. And I do definitely agree, particularly when we're looking at fields like parapsychology, we have to be aligning with researchers who are presenting strong data and strong methodological rigor, absolutely, and that's the case. I mean, even within our own community, we need to demand a high quality of science because hypnosis itself is in question. But I also think that the issue of making as many friends as we can is very important at a time when the hypnosis community in general has shrunk by, 2,000%? No, you can't shrink by 2,000%. I'm not a statistician. But it's shrunk to about 20% of what it was, 20 years ago. Certainly the membership of this society is much smaller. And so I think that over the last, 20 years, we've really, there's been this push to, present as being a very serious discipline, as being very separate from ideas that people might find questionable within the dominant scientific paradigm. And it doesn't seem to be really working in terms of expanding our numbers. So I don't see really too much of a downside to, provided that we do maintain the rigor that you suggest, to expanding our scope.
Rick, we have time for this last question, okay?
Okay. Have you considered adding into the mix the rather long tradition of psychotherapy research on the impact of understanding one another on the therapeutic outcome? Here I refer to, I'll just cite one group, Laborsky and his successors, because there's a whole tradition of measuring what the patient says and whether the therapist says is in fact connected with the main themes that are going on. The technology is there and well established. And when we talk about things like empathy and resonance, there are many, many paradigms by which these things are understood outside fields that you mentioned. Just one to mention, Bacharach did an analysis of 20 years ago of various conceptualizations of empathy. They found that empathy seemed to reduce to accuracy, which was a very unexpected outcome. So I think there are a lot of very strong research traditions out there about what kind of communication and communicative styles and process is characteristic of successful outcome, and it's there to be drawn upon.
Yeah, and I agree. It's a fascinating, really broad area empathy or actual interpersonal connection or resonance or whatever factors may be in play. Okay, so that's my time. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. So, our next speaker is Dr. Gary Elkins. Dr. Elkins is Professor and Director of the Mind-Body Medicine Research Laboratory, Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Baylor University. He is also the new president-elect. Dr. Elkins will